This is a 1995 BMW M540i, and it's one of the rarest BMW sports sedans in existence. There are just 32 of these, with V8 power, a 6-speed manual transmission, and a lot of cool stuff borrowed from the M5. And today I'm going to review this one and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this M540i is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This is a tremendously special car, very rare and very cool, as I'll explain, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this M540i, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the E34 BMW M540i. I'm going to start with an explanation of what this car is and how it possibly came about. So here's the deal. BMW made only 32 of these. That's it. This is one of 32, and they were only offered for the Canadian market. So this is a super rare, Canada-only special edition BMW. And here's what happened. The M5 was sold here in North America, including Canada, from 91 to 93. And then it was gone. But the E34 continued production through 95. And for those 2 years, BMW wanted something a little bit more special in the lineup since the M5 was gone. Something cool and sporty at the high end. Here in the United States, we got the 540i M-Spec, which was a pretty cool BMW in its own right. But Canada got a cooler one, the M540i. Although merely 32 of them existed for the entire Canadian market. But there is absolutely no question that this car was cooler than the US 540i M-Spec, and obviously rarer. And the primary reason is the Canadian M540i got some touches and upgrades from the Euro market BMW M5 that the US cars didn't get. Starting with the brakes, the M540i borrowed its brakes from the Euro M5, whereas the US market 540i M-Spec took its brakes from the US M5 that had just gone out of production. The M540i also had its suspension from the Euro M5, which of course made it especially aggressive and exciting to drive, and that included a slight lowering 20 millimeters compared to the standard car, lower ride height, and it just plain looked cooler. And there were other cool features beyond just that. These wheels, the M-Parallel wheels, weren't offered on the US E34 M5, but they were on the Euro E34 M5, and they were on the Canadian M540i. This car also got more aggressive styling than a standard 540i. The front end design was borrowed from the M5 with a lowered front valence situation that looked more aggressive and more exciting compared to a standard 5 Series. Same deal in back. You had a lowered rear section that made it more aggressive, sportier looking, particularly when paired with the lowered ride height that these cars had. The M540i also had chrome exhaust tips, which was a nice benefit that enhanced the look on the outside, and it had these special mirrors. They called them the M aerodynamic mirrors. They were smaller and sculpted in order to allow air to pass over them and through them for better aerodynamics. Whether that was true, we will never know, but this car had them. And beyond all the nice M and performance upgrades and touches, this car also featured some other cool goodies that just weren't offered on US spec E34 models, like headlight washers. As you can see, that was only on the Euro cars, but it made it to the Canadian M540i, and there were a few other little touches like that. And next up we move under the hood, and the story of the E34, M5, and 540i is especially interesting from a powertrain perspective, and that's because the M5, the ultimate high-performance version of the E34 5 Series, it had a 6-cylinder engine, but the 540i, this car, had a V8. Even though the M5 was the top performance dog, it didn't have the largest engine. So the E34 M5 here in North America had about 310 horsepower and 265 pound-feet of torque. This car had the V8, 282 horsepower, which is about 30 horses less, but it had 295 pound-feet of torque, so 30 pound-feet of torque more than the M5 six-cylinder, which was a nice upgrade over that car. Obviously, this was the last time BMW did this. Future M5 models have all had big powertrains that were the top dog in the range, but here, the 540i actually had a larger engine with more torque than the vaunted M5. But beyond that, let's talk exterior quirks and features, starting with the most obvious, namely the hood is hinged in the front. So when you pull the latch in the driver's footwell to open it, it sort of slides forward, and then you come around to the back of the hood and pull it up, and then you get access to the engine bay. Certainly the most interesting thing in this car's engine bay is right here. This is a label from the California Bureau of Automotive Repair certifying that this car is California legal. That's a big deal for an imported car. This was sold new in Canada, imported to the US, and it's very difficult to get imports legalized in California, but this one has been. It's a California legal M540i. Other interesting exterior items, for one, the badging on the back. It looks like some kid bought an M logo and stuck it on next to 540i. If you drive this thing around, people are going to think you faked the badge, even though obviously you didn't. This is how it came from the factory, but most people wouldn't know that and have never actually heard of this car, but it is real. As for the overall look and the design of this car, I still think the E34 is absolutely beautiful. In fact, I still think the E34 is the best looking 5 Series ever made. I think the design is just perfect. It was very 90s. It's certainly aging, but I think they got it just right. A fantastic mix of understated and sporty and attractive, well-proportioned, all at the same time. It is a gorgeous car that has aged fantastically, and that's especially true of this one with its M parallel wheels, its slightly lowered ride height, the front lip spoiler, the lowered rear end. This car is just so beautiful in my mind. And next up we move inside the E34 M540i, where there are quite a few interesting quirks. But let's start with the model-specific touches that helped this car stand out from a regular 5 Series, and specifically the carbon fiber trim, which is actually in a lot of places in this interior. You can see it on the door panel. There's a lot of carbon fiber there. On the passenger side of the dashboard, you got more carbon fiber, and here in the center console around the gear shifter, all carbon fiber. It looks really cool, and it was special for this car. And speaking of special for this car, one touch I absolutely love is this plaque in the center console, which specifically shows the individual number of each Canadian market M540i. You can see this one is number 3 of 32. That plaque right there certainly calls out the specialness and how exciting this car is, and it helps to kind of legitimize that it's something different from a standard 5 Series. Also in this car, you had an M gear lever, as you can see, the little M colors on one corner. And the coolest thing about this gear lever is the shift pattern actually lights up at night when you turn on the headlights. You can see it's illuminated from the inside, so it shows the gear pattern even at night, which is a pretty cool touch. They certainly didn't have to do it, but it's neat to see it done. And one other M touch worth pointing out, the door sills. You open the door and you can see the M badge there, again to remind you that this is a special car and not just your regular run-of-the-mill 540i. But anyway, next we move on to the interesting quirks and features in here. Let's start with the door panel, where you'll find a couple of interesting things. For one, there is a climate vent on the door panel, positioned right there. I guess because they didn't really have space on the dashboard for that climate vent, it's actually well positioned to blow air directly on you. It's a little bit further towards you than most car climate vents, so it's nicely placed, but it's certainly unusual to see it there. Also unusual, in the driver's door storage pocket, there basically is no storage because the pocket has been taken up by this plastic piece. It's a coin holder, I believe. You open it up, you can stick coins there. And interestingly, on the outside, it has the BMW logo on it. They're all proud of their coin holder that goes in the driver's side door pocket. Also interesting on the door panel is the power mirror controls, which have been perfectly placed. You can see them here. They're just exactly big enough to fit into this slot. They're unlabeled. You don't need to know what they are because you already know what they are. They're facing the driver. Wonderful, subtle, simple, precision placement of those controls. Now, one thing you will not find on the driver's door panel is the power window controls, and that's because they are mounted here in the center console. You can see controls for all 4 windows, front and rear. You will also see this little almost hidden button. You can press that and it stays pressed. That is the window lock. It can turn on or off the windows, again, unlabeled. You had to know what it did, but BMW figured the type of people buying this car, they were sophisticated enough to figure it out. And next up, our next interesting item in this interior is the overall orientation of the entire center control stack, which you can see is heavily oriented towards the driver. This was a BMW hallmark in this era, this driver-focused center control stack to really enhance BMW's position that this was a driver's car and that they were building the ultimate driving machine. Now, on this center control stack, some rather interesting controls. For one, this panel here, which is an information panel that shows various different things depending on what you want to press. You can get like a timer going here, the temperature, your average speed, your fuel range, the date and time, all this stuff, and you can press depending on what you want to see. This doesn't seem very sophisticated, but it is certainly a predecessor to modern day infotainment systems and screens that provide obviously a lot more capability and information, but this is kind of a good example of where it started. Now, also in this center control stack, you can see your climate controls here, which are all fairly straightforward: temperature, left, right, air position, etc. The funny thing is there is no climate control on here to turn on the windshield defroster or defogger. Instead, there's a little diagram that shows exactly what position the switches and levers should be in if you want to maximize the defrosting on your windshield. You just follow this diagram and then you'll be all set and your defrosting will occur instead of just a simple button push. And speaking of the climate controls, you can see 2 here in the center, and in between them, the single most annoying thing that German automakers did in the 90s, this little wheel, which can adjust the temperature from hot to cold if you spin it. The thing that makes no sense is this wheel completely overrides what you've selected below. So, if you have your climate control on the very hottest setting to get the warmest temperature possible, but then you just move this dial to blue for cold, you'll get cold air. Why do you have both things? I have no idea. It makes no sense, and of course BMW eventually abandoned it, probably because it confused the hell out of everybody. But this car has it. Also worth pointing out, one other interesting thing with the climate vents, this vent mounted on the dashboard is gigantic. It's the one obviously that sends air up to the windshield to do the defogging. The vent itself is notable, but the interesting thing here is this slider that allows you to turn on or off this vent. You typically don't have this for windshield climate vents, but you do in the E34. But anyway, next we move on to the rest of the interesting quirks beyond just the climate control. One is in the gauge cluster. You have a display at the bottom of the gauge cluster, a digital display that shows you information. It's controllable by pushing the end of the turn signal stalk. You push on that and it cycles through various different information, like what you have in the center control stack that I already showed you, but this one obviously closer to the driver's line of sight. Another interesting quirk, going back to the center control stack, you have kind of a hidden panel, as you can see. It looks like the stack just continues along, but there's a spot that pulls out, and indeed that's for a cigarette lighter and an ashtray. You can pull that out and do your smoking, just as the Germans would have back in this era. Next up, let's talk interesting switches, starting with this one next to the gauge cluster marked EDC. This is the suspension system that I mentioned that came from the Euromarket M5, and you can choose between 2 different settings, S or P. S stands for sport, if you want a sport suspension system, but P, well, that stands for practical, not comfort, not regular, practical, because in Germans' minds, that's what you had. You were either sporty or you were practical, and in this car, you can choose. Another interesting switch directly next to that is the fog lights, which is kind of strange in its operation. It moves up or down, and there's a little circle that actually shows what you've selected, kind of illuminating in its window whether you have the fog lights on or off. It's the same control you have over on the other side for the headlights. You kind of move the switch up or down and then look in the window to see what it is you've selected. Next up, let's talk seat controls, specifically starting with the heated seat, which is mounted right here. The control for it on the inside of the seat next to the center tunnel. You can turn it on or off pretty simple. Over on the other side of the seat, you can see your typical seat controls, but then you also have some extra controls also mounted on a rocker switch along with your memory settings. You can obviously set your seat memory and then have it go to a remembered position when you climb in the car. Next up, another switch in this interior that I absolutely love, the turn signal stalk. This switch, I think, feels the best of any turn signal stalk in any car in existence. All the BMWs from this era, the mid-90s through the early 2000s, it just feels perfect. You want to turn on your turn signal. It has the exact perfect amount of feedback. It isn't loose or floppy at all. It's just wonderful. One of my all-time favorite turn signal stalks. Yes, I am the kind of crazy that has a favorite turn signal stalk. Now, in this vicinity, I also always loved the steering wheel of the E34, specifically because they have a BMW logo in the center, but they didn't know how to make it colored, because this is a car that has an early airbag, and they didn't know how to put a colored logo and an airbag together. So you had the airbag, and then you have a blacked out logo, just because the technology hadn't yet been figured out to make it work properly. Also interesting in the steering wheel, you have M-colored stitching going around the steering wheel rim. This is another M touch that is specific to this car compared to a standard 540i, and again, it gives you a more special, sportier feel like you're driving an M car. Next up, one other interesting item in this interior, the glove box is absolutely massive. Open it up and it's huge. You can stick a lot of stuff in there, and it contains a flashlight located right here. The BMW glove box flashlight was found on a lot of BMWs in this era, even has the logo on it. Sadly, this one doesn't work, and none of them ever work, but you do have your BMW flashlight. And on the subject of lighting, one other thing to point out, the sun visors. You drop them down, and then you slide the mirror cover open and the lights turn on from above, which is the preferred placement of sun visor mirror lights, well known by people who use sun visor mirrors frequently. And it's also kind of an engineering feat. The sun visor lights aren't even on the sun visor, they're somewhere else, but we still made it work. Pretty nice. And next up, we move on to the back of the M540i. You get back here and you quickly discover it is surprisingly tight back here, especially considering this was BMW's mid-sized family sedan. Not necessarily the M540i in particular, but this generation of 5 Series was the mid-sized sedan, and there's not a lot of space. Obviously for kids, but I'm tall as an adult. My knees are pushing up against the seat in front. My head is almost hitting the ceiling. Toes don't have much space. It wasn't a big back seat, even though this was a mid-sized sedan. But you did get some nice creature comforts back here. For one thing, you got climate vents, which is pretty nice to see, especially in this era and this type of car. That's a nice luxury touch. You also had lighting. A reading light for the rear passengers was mounted on the C-pillar, as you can see, and a little switch to turn it on if you want. And of course, there's an ashtray. And not just one ashtray, but 2 individual ashtrays for both sides in the rear. Now, one thing you will not find back here is cup holders. You lower this center armrest and it is just an armrest. There's no cup holders included, and there's none in the door panels either. This is from an era when BMW thought Americans were pathetic losers for wanting to drink in the car. Their thought was driving is about driving, not sipping a coffee while you're driving. You must focus on driving. And yet this car has like 7 ashtrays. They didn't want you to drink water or coffee while you drove along, but you could totally smoke, and so could all your passengers. Now, The last interesting thing in the back seat of this car is the seatbelt placement, because the seatbelts come out from the center, as you can see, and then they connect to a buckle that's located on the outer edge of the rear seat near the rear door. Obviously, this is unorthodox, different from how other automakers did it, although other BMW models from this era also had these sort of reversed seatbelts. And I've heard from some people that this was a safety measure taken because if a first responder showed up and needed to cut you out of the car, it was easier to cut 1 point closer to the door than 2 points, and so that's why this is done. I don't know if that's true. It seems plausible, but it's certainly what they did in this car in this era. And finally, we move on to the trunk, the cargo area in the M540i. You pop it open and you discover, actually, it's quite large. There's a lot of space in this cargo area where you can put, well, a lot of stuff. You also have a little storage cubby over to the side in case there's some smaller item that you also want to put in here, in addition to larger items. But the most interesting trunk situation in this car is on the inside of the trunk lid, this giant panel. You twist the screw at the top of the panel, open it up, and it reveals a toolkit that's integrated into this trunk. And when it's down, when it's unfurled, it is perfectly flat so that you have easy access to your tools if you're trying to do some sort of roadside repair and you need to fix something. Also interesting, in this trunk, you have a handle to close it, which is indicated by this little arrow pointing down. If you take your hand and go in from there, there's the handle you can use to pull on the trunk and close it, so you don't have to close it from the outside and get dirty or get fingerprints on your precious BMW. All right, driving the E34 M540i. And I gotta say, there's so much to like about this car, starting with the fact that it's just solid. That's one of the greatest things about BMWs from this era. You know, I had an Audi from this era, an RS2, and it was very plasticky and felt very fall-apart-y. But BMW and Mercedes were at a great time in their brand histories. They were making really solid-feeling, solidly built cars. And that's clearly true of the shift lever, the clutch, all the stuff in here. And I talk about the turn signal stock every time I review a BMW from this era. And that's because it just felt perfect. It was just right. And that's true of a lot of the stuff in here. The doors open and close with very solid feel. The latches on the doors are very solid. BMW and Mercedes were very committed to production quality and high production standards. That was how they sold cars. You know, these days, luxury and quality is more synonymous with technology. But back in the day, you know, it was all about like the feel, the solidity, the bank vault. And that's what Mercedes had, and that's what BMW was going after, and they did a great job doing it by this time period. Interestingly, I surprisingly actually like the clutch and shifter quite a bit, which isn't something I always say about BMWs from this era. I often find BMW clutches from the 90s, the 2000s to be a little bit springy. They're not particularly linear. And I find that the shifters can be also a little rubbery. This was generally true. I felt this way about a lot of BMWs from this era and later. But this particular car, it's pretty perfect actually. The clutch is a little heavier than you might want, but that kind of gives you the solid feel that you're looking for. And the shifter is nice and notchy, short throws, feels great going into gear. It's actually really excellent. All right, so how does it feel in the road? Well, the V8 is pretty responsive, although it doesn't feel as muscular as I was expecting. It's a little displacement V8, doesn't make an enormous amount of power, and that just kind of seems about right, I suppose. But even though it's a V8, you're not going to get a big rumble out of this powertrain. You actually instead, it feels like a V8 in the sense that it's got a lot of torque and it feels like big low-end torque, but you don't have sort of that real rumble of a V8. Nonetheless, it is quick and it feels quick, and you can tell that it's quick quite immediately when you're driving this car, and it feels smooth, great smooth power delivery. The powertrain feels tight, well developed, just like a good, nice V8. The BMW used this V8 in a lot of cars for a long time, and it did have some issues. But in this particular car, it doesn't feel like that. It feels nice, feels high quality, and it feels like you can really wring it out in a very smooth, kind of calm, comfortable way, which is impressive. This car has 215,000 kilometers on it, probably about 130, 140,000 miles. It's been driven a lot, but the engine still feels pretty strong. And pretty smooth. And it's fast, so this car does feel nice and quick, and it gets going when you get kind of higher up in the rev range. Like a lot of cars from this era, it does take some time to build, and unlike turbocharged cars, the power does build smoothly, but low-end power is not necessarily the main thing that's there. You do have good low-end torque. You can feel that it's a powerful engine, but it definitely is a little short on like fast speed performance at the very beginning of a rev range. Now, one complaint a lot of people had about the E34 and its drive and feel is that it's a little bit slow to respond, and that's definitely true in terms of handling. The steering precision is not exactly massive. I mean, it's not incredibly quick to turn when you turn the wheel. The car does handle pretty well. This one seems like it sprung nicely. The suspension is fairly flat, and you don't have a huge amount of body roll, which kind of surprises me because I had a buddy who had an E34 M5 that did have a lot of body roll, but this car has the Euro M5 suspension. It's probably a little bit tighter, and I think that really contributes to this car feeling more stable and more planted on the road. There's a lot to like with this car, and you get to drive around in the beautiful E34, which I really think is one of the most beautiful BMWs, and to this day, the most beautiful 5 Series. It just looks great. And it drives reasonably well and considerably better than the Audi RS2 that I had from this era also. This car is just clearly better built, better designed for a better performance car experience, and it delivers that. And so that's the E34 BMW M540i, one of the coolest, rarest sedans of its day. A very special car, and you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this E34 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 51 out of 100, which puts the M540i here against some similar cars. It's just 1 point behind the E34 M5, which makes sense because these cars share a lot of similarities. But the M5 gets an extra point for cool factor because, well, it's an M5. Although those who really know may actually find a low-volume M540i a little cooler. Regardless, this is a special car with a surprisingly nice driving experience along with some good practicality and excellent styling.